Okay.
So, welcome to another show. So, today we have Bruce Strom, who's on the show today, and he has his own YouTube channel talking about philosophy, morality, and history, to name but a few other things as well. So, welcome to today's show, Bruce.
Well, thank you for having me. I very much enjoy coming on. So,
Fantastic. So, I've actually had a look at quite a lot of your videos on YouTube. You're doing, pretty well now. You got some, quite a number of thousand views on at least a couple of your videos. So philosophy is quite a broad subject, isn't it? And there's obviously a history of the pre-Socratic, Socratic, Hellenistic, Roman philosophies. Which of those are your favorite, and why?
well, I think my favorite, well, philosophy is really three different strands. I mean, you have and I think modern philosophers tend to look at the first strand, which is the physics or the philosophy of knowledge, the metaphysics. And that's the theory of knowledge. And all of those schools of thought have really spun off into their own separate fields, whether it be psychology or medicine or biology or whatever. And then you also have the very important topic of logic, because you have to know how to speak to each other in a logical manner to have a meaningful conversation. You have to be careful to say, define your terms, otherwise, you're talking past each other. But the most important strain of philosophy to the ancients is moral philosophy, ethics, and really what really turned me on to what really turned me on to the Stoics was a lecture by Timothy Johnson, who was a professor with the teaching company, and his lectures were never brought to Wondrium. They've never promoted these lectures, but he had a series of lectures on Greco-Roman moral philosophers, which really turned me on to the Stoics. And a lot of the philosophers tend to elevate Plato and deprecate the Stoics, but really, I think the Stoicism is the dominant form of philosophy. And I think you can look at Stoicism with a small s and with a big S. Of course, the big S Stoicism started with Zeno. He was a cynic. He was a philosopher after Plato, but really he was a continuation of the Cynic philosophy. And the Cynic philosophers started with Antisthenes, who was a student of Socrates, and so the Stoics inherited much of the Cynic thought, the Greek Cynic thought, and but I think really for the smallest Stoicism is really beginning with the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I think that here again, that is the key to understanding much of the philosophy of the ancient world, because the ancient world, quite frankly, was a warrior society. How did the Iliad begin? Rage. That's the first word of the Iliad, and it discusses how Achilles and Agamemnon are fighting over a concubine they seized in war, and the attitudes that you're forced to have in an ancient warrior culture are really Stoic virtues. Because in an ancient warrior culture, you didn't worry about retirement. Okay. You didn't worry about retirement because um, that just wasn't a concern. You were worried that before you died, some enemy city state, some hostile enemy city state might totally defeat your city state, slaughter all the military age men, and enslave the women and children and burn everything in sight and take away everything that you owned. And that was the fear. And that fear just kind of like undergirds the entirety of the ancient world. And in another strain, like Dr. Philip Carey, another teaching company professor, said this, another thing about the ancient world is there are still beasts out in the woods. And, whether or not your children would wander around in the fields and get mauled by wild beasts was a real concern. Whereas today, they wanted to control the passions because they didn't want to be like the wild beasts. Whereas today, our concern is very different. We don't want to be like, we want to be passionate. We want the passions because we don't want to be like robots, the unfeeling robots. They're in so many of our science fiction movies. So the ancient world was a different world. And, and I think that just undercuts so much. Many of the so-called hard sayings in the Bibles are explained by this, by this the fact that this was the ancient world was a warrior culture.
Yeah, I mean, you've gone through quite a lot there from for me, probably the funniest philosopher, Diogenes, the Cynic, moving into the fact that you believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that Zeno wasn't necessarily the founder of Stoicism, but it started with, as you said, the Iliad, etc. For me as well, you also mentioned the fact that it was important for people to be able to fight in the past because obviously it was a case of protecting their homes, whereas obviously now, everyone's got a mortgage, everyone owned their own house, and it was very much a different kettle of fish in the past. Stoicism wise, I think for me, a quote that really sums up Stoicism pretty well is the Marcus Aurelius one that says, "To be like the rock that the waves keep crashing over, it stands unmoved and the raging of the sea falls still around it." What does Stoicism mean to you specifically? And just a quick caveat on that as well, because maybe this is a two-part approach. One is a Stoic philosophy and what that fundamentally means in terms of, I don't know, controlling your mindset or remaining unemotional. But coming back to the war side and who your favorite philosopher is, obviously you mentioned Plato, but obviously Aristotle was, the subsequent philosopher to Plato, and he was mentor to Alexander the Great. So does the mentorship fall in line with that, the old importance of war, and then obviously moving into Stoic philosophy, and does that all form part of a single journey?
Um, well, I think that well, it's interesting. Aristotle was actually influenced Alexander the Great. Of course, Alexander the Great was pure warrior, but he also had a lot of Stoic virtues in that he went over to Persia, and he behaved. One of the reasons for his success is he did not behave as a warrior should behave in some respects. I mean, when he defeated Darius, he took his mother and he of course captured his harem, including his mother, Darius's mother, and he treated them with kindness and respect as befitting royalty. And so he didn't. And then he had his men. He and his men married many Persians and and Indians. And so it's he didn't behave as in all respects as a conqueror would behave. He behaved as if he was the true king of Persia. So he had better luck. Of course, Plato tried to influence the warrior the king in Sicily, being his tutor, and almost got imprisoned and possibly executed for his efforts. So that was not a successful effort. And of course, we had Marcus Aurelius, the true philosopher king, who unfortunately ruined his legacy by his son Commodus, who was probably one of the most bloodthirsty Roman emperors of history. So there's a mixed bag there. So it's politics is always messy. Politics is always messy. But I think Stoicism, what appeals to me about Stoicism is it lets you cope with life. And Stoicism is really a reflection of the Christian virtues. And what is the main Christian virtues? You should love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And you should love your neighbor. The concept that you should love your neighbor is throughout Stoicism. You can see it in Seneca, you can see it in Marcus Aurelius, you can see it in Epictetus, you can see it in all the Stoic philosophers. And and also they talk about God as if he's a monotheistic God. The technical term is henotheist because they never deny the existence of the other gods. They just never talk about them. Although Marcus Aurelius does drop a line here and there to the other gods. So I think that's really what appeals to me about Stoicism is it teaches you how to lead a godly life. I mean that's really the crux of our time here on earth is living a godly life. And I think Luke Timothy Johnson, the professor that inspired me, made the point that the Stoic philosophers were evangelists. They went out and tried to convert their neighbors into saying, hey, Stoic philosophy will teach you how to lead a godly life. And these people were like the Stoic philosophers were like the Ann Landers of the day and the Dr. Phils of the day. They wanted to really teach people how to live a better life.
Do you believe
That's
that virtues can be learnt then, or do you think they are inherent? Because I know that there's some Socratic arguments as to whether or not virtues can be taught or not. What's your stance on that?
well, my stance on that is very simple. Is that of course you can. It takes a little bit of effort to learn how to live a godly life because well the enemy is so deceitful, and uh, that's why the Jewish traditions are founded on the basis of the study of the Torah and the study of what it takes, what you should do to live a godly life. And there, of course, they have many ceremonial type laws, but they also have a lot of ethical laws that are very helpful and very useful and really produce the foundation of Christianity. And so, and there's a lot of the sayings of the Jewish rabbis that are likewise are very Stoic in nature. You know, like my favorite one is from Hillel that I've always found inspiration from. He says, and you can see that sometimes today. I feel kind of like alone as a Christian in this country because so many of my Christian brothers say things that well just aren't Christian. And Hillel once said that if you find yourself in a country where there are no men, be a man, which is a very Stoic like quote. And so Stoicism is one of those type of default philosophies. It just kind of evolves when you're challenged, when life challenges you. Like one of the things that has always perplexed me about my fellow Christians is they seem to want to pray to God for God to take suffering away from their lives. And as you know, God just doesn't do that. I mean, we all suffer. And
Yeah.
and Stoicism teaches that regardless of the suffering, we should endure our sufferings, and because God sends the rain on both the good and the bad.
I mean, for me,
And
the suffering is imperative to living a good life. We can't have just an easy life. Imagine you've got a child and they want sweets every 5 minutes. You, as the father, or you as the mother, and you as the parent, have got to say no sometimes. And from the child's perspective, they think that, you as the parent or you as God as being idiotic essentially by not giving them what they want, and they are chasing hedonism to an extent. But the argument I say is, look, suffering is what helps us to develop into the individual that we need to be. If you go to the gym, you're going to feel pain, but it's going to mean that you get a better body at the end. You become fitter and stronger. But as you said, stoicism is something that helps you in that period of time where you're going through that pain, you're going through that suffering, but understanding that you need to come out the other side. To have virtue, you need to have those people who lack virtue. To have the stars in the sky, you need to have a dark background against which the stars can shine. So for each virtue, there is um, uh, an opposite trait that obviously is a contrast. So I think that you need both. You can't have an idealistic world where everyone is perfect. It just doesn't work like that. For me anyway, on a realistic basis, yes, idealistically everyone would be perfectly virtuous, but unfortunately it doesn't work like that. Why is it that ethics interests you more than epistemology or metaphysics, for example? Why is it ethics that specifically interests you? Is it because you can utilize that in your own life, or is there another reason?
well, it's like the rabbi said. The rabbi says, the what you sum up the Judeo-Christian tradition, and how's it summarized? You love God and love your neighbor. All else is commentary, and that's the crux of it. And my favorite saint is Saint Augustine, because Saint Augustine basically teaches us that in all his writings, he reminds us that that's the most important thing. He explicitly reminds us that loving God is and loving your neighbor is key. And I'd like to say that loving God, even if you don't want to buy into the Christian point of view, I mean it's the love of the ideal, the love of the ideal, the idea that um, there is a truth, a universal truth out there that you should ascribe to.
You've
And I
mentioned
think,
Judeo-Christian a couple of times over the last few answers. Why is it then that if there's so many similarities between obviously the Jews, the Christians, and indeed the Muslims, essentially they believe the same story to an extent, but the Jews believe that Jesus wasn't the Son of God. The Christians believe that he was, and the Muslims believe that yes, he was a prophet, but he wasn't the prophet. Why is there so many arguments when essentially you all inherently believe the same fundamental beliefs to an extent? Though there's obviously a caveat there, of course.
well, because simply, I think the best answer to that is a charming book by which I'm going to cover eventually. The Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis, and that's a fascinating topic. In other words, the idea is that the demons are real, um, and they are, and maybe they're in our minds, maybe they're just part of our psyche, maybe they're not physical human beings, although Christianity teaches us that they are. Um, but um, but basically, the idea is, well, yeah, uh, God does not want us. I mean, the demons do not want us to be devout. They do not want us to pray to God and be devout and worship God and reverence God. But if they fail in that venture, well, then they'll drop back and then uh, attempt that. Then they'll tempt us to be hypocritical and judgmental. And so you see that in all of the conversely, like if we want to study scripture, the demons don't want us to study scripture, but if they're not successful in that, then they want us to take pride in studying scripture. So, it's I think that's the best answer to
So
that.
for those people who don't believe in God at all, they're probably listening to this thinking, well, because God does have its negative connotations nowadays, doesn't it? Especially in the secular society that we live in today, and the generosity that goes on around. What's your argument for God? Is it the miracle based argument? Is it cosmological? Is it the teleological based argument? What is it that you can, for you anyway, have some sort of evidence? And I know again, evidence is a word that's that has got its associations. But what is it that you can take as evidence, or is it 100% faith based?
Um, it's the dilemma is that if you have I don't really like to get into the arguments of whether or not God exists, because to a certain extent they're pointless. I mean, I think that God does not need us to believe that he exists to exist. And to a certain extent, uh, if we don't know that God does exist, but we instead decide to lead a godly life, in a way that's even better, because then we are living a godly life with no prospect of reward. So I think ethics is really love of neighbor and love of God, love of the ideal is the core of life. And the existence of God, well, we can argue about that if we like, but that sometimes is a distracting debate. And I don't really like to argue about it ad infinitum, because that's not the, there's nothing wrong with saying God exists because we want him to exist. Because people who want to live a godly life want the God to exist, and people who want to lead a more selfish or hedonistic life don't like a world where God exists. So in the long run, I think to a certain extent, it's a pointless argument.
No, that's fair, to be fair, because yeah, as you say, for people, we all have confirmation bias, don't we? So any argument that you put forward is going to fall in line with either the fact that you agree that there is a God, or that you don't agree with that there's a God. So yeah, in some respects, it is an argument that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So just coming
Yeah,
back
so
to
really the argument should be, do you want to live a godly life or not? That's what you should argue about. That's the argument that's important, not whether or not God exists, but whether or not you want to live a godly life.
so bringing
That's
that
where you
back
should
to
start.
Stoicism then. So how does this, because I know that you're a Christian, how do they fall in line with each other from your experience? And what are the important parts of Stoicism that people can, if they don't believe in Christianity or any religion or God for them, how can they use Stoicism in their own life just to improve it without any connotations of God involved.
Well, so many of the quotes of the Stoics sound like the New Testament anyway. And they had a direct, in of course, the Jewish tradition influenced the Christian tradition very deeply. But second in line was Stoicism. Stoicism was a secondary and major influence in Christianity, and you see it most vividly in the writings of the Desert Church Fathers and the early Eastern Church Fathers. They just sound like they're Stoics. Like you get the Philokalia, which is the one of the compendiums of works of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and it's also the first millennium, so it's in the Catholic tradition as well. Although Catholics kind of deprecate it. The last chapter in the English translation of the first volume is is what used to be the first chapter in the Greek, and it's a Stoic writing. It's really a writing by a Stoic philosopher, and so, and of course Aristotle influenced Stoicism deeply because Stoicism borrowed a lot of his lists of the virtues and vices, and so, and to a certain extent, Plato is you look at Xenophon's writings of Plato, and he is really picturing a Stoic Socrates with a small s, of course.
So, who is your favorite Stoic philosopher then? You mentioned that even those from a pre, well, from a Socratic sense, can also be well, you can show similarities with those of Stoicism. So, of the actual Stoic philosophers, who is your favorite and why?
I don't really know if I have a favorite. I like them all. I like the main line. Epictetus is wonderful. Epictetus lived around the same. Epictetus and Seneca, they both lived around the same time of. Epictetus and Seneca both lived around the time of St. Paul, roughly. You have Marcus Aurelius, which is remarkable. You have Musonius Rufus, who was the teacher of Epictetus, the big four. And then, I'm going to be reading more Plutarch and more Cicero. That's one of my next projects. I mean, I don't know that I have a favorite. They're all great, you know. Um, I think we can take inspiration from Epictetus because he was a former slave of a former slave. I mean, he was like the bottom rungs of society, and yet he attracted the attention of the emperors who exiled him because he was a philosopher. But then you have on the other extreme, you have Seneca, who's one of the most fabulously wealthy persons in the Roman Empire when he was alive, and you have Marcus Aurelius, who was the ultimate of power. He was a Roman emperor who really tried to live the life of the Stoic philosopher. And of course, one of the more interesting questions with that is, was he a friend or foe of Christianity? And that's an interesting debate to itself,
I'm,
very
I'm
captivating.
glad you
But they're all,
mentioned the Epictetus versus Aurelius, because I think that's a really important part of Stoic philosophy for me, and I'm glad that you picked up on it as well. Is that you've got Epictetus at one end, a former slave, and you've got the most powerful man in the world at the time, or who he perceives himself to be, because he didn't really know anything outside of the empire. And there is some fundamental similarities between the two, and that's what I find to be so amazing. Because if you look at the people who run societies today, they lack integrity. They lack any form of um, self-reflection or philosophy. I mean, if you look at the book Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, some of the stuff in there is just, it's a magic, really, considering, as you said, where what his role was. And as you also said earlier, it's a bit of a shame as to how his son turned out. But people can look at that from if anyone's seen the film Gladiator, it's not really a great representation, but um, for something physical for someone to see, maybe that's something they can look at. When did you get into philosophy then? Is it something that you've always um understood, or is it something, was there a life change that happened for you, or was there something else that made you get into philosophy?
um, well, basically, I always like to read. I've always liked to read philosophy, and I think really the what really led me to philosophy is back when the teaching company got founded. I don't know if you've heard of that. That's Wondrium now. They have a lot of the lectures for college professors at the time. I mean, that was before YouTube days. They started before YouTube, and and so I've been listening to those lectures for like 20 or 30 years now, and have listened to the bulk of the philosophy and religious videos that they have, and I just find it fascinating. And then of course you go and read them, and the blessing is, since I've retired a couple of years ago, I just started reading more deeply into many of these works, and you know, so I'm just plowing through them one at a time.
So you mentioned
And
listening to lectures. What about book-wise then? Is there any specific recommendations that you've got? Because you're obviously very well read. It comes across just from how you're answering questions, for example, and um, linking everything together. Is there any sort of, I know it's very difficult to say one book because you'd be like, well, you need to be reading this, that, and the other. But if there's any sort of one book that you feel is a great starter book for those who maybe not sort of learned any philosophy, what would it be?
it's really hard to say one book. I mean, any of the four philosophers that we just, the Stoics are easy read. Plato's a difficult read. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's difficult to follow in places. The philosophy, the cornerstone of the Western tradition is St. Augustine's Confessions. And anytime you have a lecture series on psychology, they include a discussion of the Confessions, because he plumbs the inner soul. What does it mean for what does memory mean? And he has a lot of interesting questions. A lot of questions that people use to challenge Christians on their faith are questions that are answered in the Confessions. And so that is a remarkable book. His book on St. Augustine's book on Christian doctrine, and that's a shorter treatise. And there he teaches us that we should interpret scriptures in light of the twofold love of God and neighbor. And if a set of verses in the scriptures appear not to follow along with that with a twofold love, then those verses should be interpreted allegorically. And like I say constantly, one of the best examples of that is the famous verse in the Psalms, where the psalmist rejoices when he bashes the heads of the Babylonian babies on the rocks. And people say, "Oh, how cruel is that?" Well, the uh, Eastern Church Fathers love that verse because they interpret it this way. They say we should eliminate all the sins of our lives, both the little sins and the big sins. And many of the monastic writings are really just as even more valuable than the Stoics, I think.
So what are some of the answers, or what are some of the questions rather that are answered in that Confessions that you mentioned?
Uh, if you remember, well, his biography is that he was a young man, and his father was a pagan. His Christian was a mother. His mother was a Christian, okay, and she prayed that he be in the Catholic Church, but he thought it was backwards because the scriptures at that time were not the scriptures of the Vulgate by Jerome. Jerome was his contemporary, so that wouldn't be translated till much time later. He just saw it as a very like many people today, view Christianity as a backwards, ignorant type of religion. True scholars wouldn't be Christian because of the scriptures at the time were just very written in very bad Latin in the translations he read. And so he became a Manichae. And a Manichae is one of the dualistic Gnostic type systems. It it descended from Zoroastrianism, but it wasn't really true Zoroastrianism. And he basically came to see the falsities in Manichaeism, and he also got converted to philosophy by reading Cicero's Hortensius, which unfortunately is lost to history. And so he became converted. He converted to Neoplatonism before he converted to Christianity, which back in the day was a very common path to Christianity. That was not uncommon. And he basically answered many of the doubts people have about Christianity today in the Confessions. But as you know, he's considered a Catholic writer. So anybody with a Protestant background thinks that all Catholics can't be saved still, and so they deprecate all of the Catholic tradition, which is a shame because there's a lot of wisdom in the Church Fathers. I mean, just a continuum from the Stoic philosophers, from the Greco-Roman Stoic philosophy and Platonic philosophy through Christianity through today, and and they influenced Protestantism also, and which Protestants don't want to believe, but that's true. So
the Jesuits fit anywhere in, because you mentioned Christianity and Rome and the Catholics. The Jesuits fit in anywhere with this? Because I know you've spoken briefly about this on your YouTube channel as well.
I am not an expert on Jesuits. I did one video on the Jesuits from, and I'm going to do another video on the early Jesuits, written by William O'Malley, a father. I believe is it Thomas? I'm pretty sure it's William O'Malley. It's a Jesuit priest. He's famous for writing a definitive history of the Second Vatican Council and the First Vatican Council and the Council of Trent. And that's another fascinating avenue of learning, because Vatican II is unimaginable. Vatican II is unimaginable without the experiences that the Catholics faced during World War II. And many of the Catholics today just don't realize the history behind Vatican II when they try and claim that it's an invalid council. And Vatican II has many of the, it really, the Catholic Church is one of the forefronts of social justice, and that we see today in the civil rights struggle. I mean, they were the Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum may have been a big influence on the New Deal of FDR. So, I mean, there's a great amount of history there, and I think a lot of Catholics don't realize that. And of course, he also did a couple of books on the Jesuits. So I just basically, read his book and commented on the book. Most of my videos are book reviews, by the way, mostly, with some of my own thoughts added to
it. What's your thoughts then, if you were to give an opinion on whether or not there's a lot of hidden knowledge in the Vatican? Because obviously they've got miles and miles of literature, some of which you're not allowed to actually see without someone overlooking you, I believe. What are your thoughts on what could be hidden there?
I don't think that I mean, it's like anything else. They don't like to release some of the inner documents until they're really historical, until they faded from view. And they've already released all of the World War II archives have been fully opened. And so I don't know that there's a lot of hidden, quote, hidden things, unquote, in the Vatican. Of course, if there's any scandals, I mean, it's not fair to people to air the scandals while the people are alive or their descendants are alive. So in a way, I can see their point. But I think I think that's Dan Brown's conspiracy theory type of stuff. I don't really think that there's a lot to be learned. From the stuff they're hiding. They have a reason for it, and it's not going to be hidden forever. So.
What?
And
Okay,
I think
so on the flip
perhaps
side,
they hide too much. I think they hide too much. I mean, you got to remember back the Catholic histories back in the Council of Trent. What happened is they hid the proceedings of the Council of Trent until the early 20th century because they feared that the Protestants would go and dig through them and kind of like cherry pick them and use it to crucify them. So they're a little defensive historically, and I think probably they do hide, quote, hide, unquote, too much. But I think there's less of that now.
so on the flip side of hiding knowledge, what knowledge do you think that is out there but is not well enough known? Maybe it's some of the Stoic philosophy stuff. Maybe it's something very niche within philosophy. Is there anything that you think most people should know and sort of actively seek knowledge in that area? Because for me, there's so much stuff on the internet now. This obviously before you used to have to go to the library and find the books and go through all the pages and actually look through and read the entire book. Now you can basically search for an article, keywords, and you can learn stuff a lot faster. Okay, maybe not in as much depth as reading a full book. That's a given, but you can get surface level knowledge a lot easier today than you ever have done. Is there anything specifically that you feel everyone should know?
Oh, okay. Well, you're asking me for hidden knowledge, and then you're asking me two questions. I can tell you what I can answer the hidden knowledge question. There's the scripts. There is a complete ancient library surviving the Herculaneum. I think that's how you say it. The sister city for Vesuvius. The problem is they're all charred, and they're afraid that and they're very hard to read, and they're trying to figure out. Scientists are desperately trying to figure out a way to read these scrolls without unraveling them, which would totally destroy them because then they just crumble into dust. And they're just salivating at the thought of there's dozens and dozens and dozens of scrolls that they know they're ancient works that they've never seen before. Maybe the Hortensius is in there, and so that's where that's if you're talking about hidden knowledge, well, that's hidden. Maybe one day scientists will figure out how to read those scrolls, or maybe not.
That's
But
interesting, actually. To be fair, that's very
yeah, but
interesting. But the
yeah,
question
that's
was more of available knowledge, what people should be aware of, because there's things that you know that you don't know, and then there's things that you know that you. So there's things that you don't know that you don't know, and then there's things that you know that you don't know. So obviously,
I'd
with
say
that
just
scroll, you
just
don't know that you don't know those things. Whereas obviously, if you can actively say to someone, "Look, this is what you should be looking for to give yourself a better life." Obviously, we've talked about stoicism and philosophy in general, but on a specific basis, for people to maybe look at improving their mentality or their psyche or whatever it's going to be.
you
Or
have
is
the
it just a
scriptures.
case of reading the Bible, given your religious
Yeah,
underpinning?
you have the scriptures and you have the commentators. I think people in a Protestant tradition tend to deprecate the commentators because they say, "Oh, the scriptures are all you need," but yet they use commentaries to help Protestant commentaries to help them read the scriptures, like books by Billy Graham. And the church fathers are really the Billy Grahams of the modern world. So I think that reading the church fathers and reading the philosophers and doing the hard work of reading some the challenging work of reading things that are a little more difficult to read, like the Platonic dialogues, and learning how to read them. I mean, it's like, and we have so many tools now. Like a lot of these ancient documents, they're so long-winded. I tell you what I do a lot of times is I go on Wikipedia and look at the summaries and pick out what I want to read out of them and skip the portions that I don't want to read. And sometimes you miss a little bit that way. So I think you just need to do the work and follow the commentators. I mean, now you have like the InterVarsity Press has a series of the Church Father commentaries on the scriptures, and they have another series of the Reformation thinkers and their commentaries on Scripture, and so you can summarize it from there and go backwards. Um, just instead of watching football and learning about football statistics and all these other things, read what will improve your lives. Because it's like
100%.
the Ten Commandments. I mean, look at the Ten Commandments. It starts off with you know uh, if you have proper thoughts, okay, then if you get your thinking right, then your words are going to come out right, and your thinking and your words are going to come out are proper and holy. Well, then your actions will be holy. And so that's basically it. Living a godly life takes a certain amount of study if you're going to, because that is how you ferret out the deceptions that are society throws at us. And one of the deceptions that I see a lot is this concept of what is self-love. And you hear this in any of the divorce support groups or any of the therapy type sessions is, oh, you got to love yourself before you can love your neighbor. Well, where did that thought came from? But when you come right down to it and you probe it, people don't really put a lot of thought into what that actually means. And like anything else, where you start is what is the definition of self-love? Because Eastern Church fathers say that self-love is horrible. Selfishness is the opposite of selflessness. So of course you shouldn't love yourself. And then St. Augustine says, yeah, you should love yourself because then you can love your neighbor. But then you start probing St. Augustine, and his definition of self-love is there's good self-love and there's bad self-love. So he's saying the same thing, except with he's defining the words a little bit differently, but the message is the same. And his
Yeah,
definition of the good self-love are just like the monastic church fathers on saying what selfless love is.
this is it though. So like you can take this again back to the Roman times where they use gladiators and they use football now, as you said, sport to basically uh, not coerce the masses, but basically blind them from what's actually going on. I mean, the word sport I think comes from the French desporter, which means to basically keep you away from or misguide in some respect. So what you're saying is instead of doing that, incorporate yourself to the academy, to the Lyceum, and actually read about these great philosophers, which will improve your life, as you've said, rather than these small changes are what make the big difference. Instead of watching TV for an hour, watching Love Island or whatever bullshit you want to watch, read or listen to your YouTube channel or listen to a podcast or read a book. I mean, look at all the people behind you on the School of Athens photo, I believe that is, isn't it? Look at all the wisdom there. Even by reading these things, it activates your mind. Reading improves your memory as well, doesn't it? Actually, coming on to that, I know you're an advocate of well, not an advocate. That's a real bad way to look at that. But you're um a proponent of dementia, aren't you? And something that you hold quite close to your heart. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Well, I got into that a little bit in an unusual manner. I'm in an over 55 condo units, and I was one of the officers, and we had a neighbor that had advanced dementia, and he was being foreclosed upon. They were going to foreclose his house and kick him out on the street so they could get their unpaid maintenance fees. And he'd been dragging this out. He had an alcoholic girlfriend, and she'd been negotiating in bad faith with the attorney. We didn't really know this for the past decade. And when the money ran out, she finally left him, and they broke up, quote unquote. But they were going to kick him out on the street, and the reason why we had one of the other neighbors in the hearing say, look, there's something wrong with this guy. I think he's got dementia. You really just can't kick him out. And he says, no, we're tired of him. His demented behavior pissed him off. He, in addition to his financial affairs, which is another sign of dementia, he was threatening people, and he was harassing his neighbors, and he'd go in the office and harass the people in the office. And there's even rumors he was waving a gun around. Now, we never found a gun, so I don't think that's true, but it might have been. Who knows? And so basically, I had the attorney halt the foreclosure. And one of the officers, who was one of my political enemies on the board, decided to censure me for this 6 months later because he was pissed. And I said, hello. And not only that, he had the attorney write a nasty letter to all 1,500 buildings in my complex. And so I basically spent a couple of $1,000 and rebutted it, said on the red letters on the outside of the envelope, I'm being censured because I halted the foreclosure of somebody with advanced dementia who was able to be appointed a court guardian so that he could be placed in a facility, and then his condo sold and his debt settled in good order. And so that's kind of like how I got into it. And really, when you come right down to it, the concept that somebody is is not responsible for their actions is a concept that people just do not want to accept because it's the basis of our legal tradition. It's the basis of our religious tradition. The concept that we have free will and that we are responsible for our actions is a key of everything. But as modern medicine has discovered, we keep running into more and more conditions where that just simply isn't true. We're just totally captive to, if we have a neurological failing, we're captive to our emotions and in ways we don't totally understand. And so that's basically, basically we need to learn how to deal with that. Like um, if somebody is young and they have aging parents alone, they may have somebody who's homeless or is an alcoholic latch onto them and suck them dry for everything that they have and drain all their assets. And and if they ever marry them, you're toast. You can't do anything about it under our legal system. I don't know what it's like in England. So it's just they're just toast. And you just have to realize that if somebody's 70 years old or even 60 sometimes, but definitely in their 70s, if they behave in a strange manner or they're saying something sexually inappropriate or they're a little bit lashing out at people, you just can't rule out dementia. You just can't. I mean, so you have to be a little more patient with people who are elderly. And so it's a very tragic condition. Um, and I
Yeah.
think the police over here are starting to learn how to deal with mental illness in general, but not so much dementia. So that's changing somewhat slowly. So I don't know what it's like over there with those kind of issues.
Yeah, I mean, for me, and this is the beauty of sort of philosophy. I mean, obviously, Bruce Willis is someone who recently has been diagnosed with it as well, from my understanding. But the Socratic method obviously is asking questions, isn't it? Instead of stating things. So for me, the question will be, well, what's causing the increase or uptick in dementia? Is it aluminium, metals, fluoride, things like that? That's the first question. What's causing it? And secondly, as you said, how do you deal with people who've got dementia? How do you protect against people who are going to take advantage of them? How do you protect themselves against themselves? In terms of getting themselves into sticky situations. So they're the answers that we need to answer really to improve on a situation that shouldn't, that no one wants to be there. But obviously, all you can do is play the card that's been dealt essentially, and that's what we need to do. I'm not sure what your thoughts on it are, but there would be my two stances on it.
Well, I think the answer to that is the anti-psychiatry movement back in the 70s really led to the passage of like the HIPAA laws over here, which state that the patients have rights and you can't really just commit people without giving them agency. You have to give the mentally ill a certain amount of agency because they're not totally helpless. And the dilemma is that there are some people who are mentally ill who have no agency. And so people will take advantage of them if you go too far with this. And so I think, personally, I think the society needs to dial back um, some of the protections they give to the patient, and you need to have more power in people, you know, putting them in facilities where they won't be taken advantage of. And of course, the problem with that, anything like that, it's just like it's Hegelian back and forth, to and fro, so you just have to do the best you can. But I think the best thing is like if somebody is alone, if you have an aging parent and they're getting in their 60s and 70s, you really need to not leave them alone, but you need to be active in their lives and be aware of what's going on. And if you can, get them to move in with you or move near you, rather than being in another state, which is so common today.
Is there
So,
also a question of punishment for the perpetrators who do take advantage of these people and making it so because I'm a strong believer that the severity of the punishment of a crime can act as some form of deterrent. Now, obviously, it's not going to act as a deterrent for everyone, and that's just the case with anything. If you look at either end of any spectrum, there's going to be some disparity, but on a general basis, if there is a it's like the positive, negative reinforcement, operant conditioning. You know, you do something people don't like or like, it's either going to make them behave more like something or less like something. So could that be an option as well?
You know, I got a cousin who is lived the sex, drugs, and rock and roll life back in the day, and now they're elderly and they have nothing. And the problem is you have somebody basically who has no life, who has no employment history, who has no income. How can you punish them other than throwing them? You can lock them up so they won't hurt people, but there's really no way you can punish them. You can only punish people who have a life. But if you have no life, you can't really punish them effectively. There's no effective punishment. And so that's that kind of like
You can though, because there's negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement. So for example, if you want to give if you want to reward your child for doing well, you can either give them a PlayStation, which is a positive reinforcement, or you can take something away. So remove their need to do the chores, for example, and that can act as a reward. The same as if you want to punish someone, you can either give them a punishment by punching them in the face, not that I'm condoning that, or you can take something away from them, take away their PlayStation, that can be a punishment. So as part of the operant conditioning, you can still punish them, but I get what you're saying. It's harder to punish someone
but
without
if
having
you're
taken
living on
something away.
Skid Row and you have nothing and you can't get a job because you have no employment history and you have a record your an arm as long as your arm and you have no money whatsoever and you have no car and you're living on the streets. There's nothing to take away from you.
No, that's
What are
true.
you going
Yeah,
to do?
you're
There's
going
no
from you go.
PlayStation to take away. You
Yeah,
know.
you're going from no square meals to 3 square meals and a bed.
Yeah, no, the punishment is better than the what was before. So
But I think that's the minority, isn't it? The people who fall in that category are probably going to be few and far between, I would suspect. But
I
again,
think
anything,
the majority of crimes are committed by just such people. I think to a certain extent.
yeah, well, maybe them type of crimes, I suppose. But I think with anything, there has to be some bespoke level of thinking as to
Well,
what
anyway,
the
this
best
other
course of
fella, what
action.
happened to this other fella's girlfriend is a year after he was placed into in the year after he was placed in the facility, she died of alcoholism. So so it's like the Stoics say, the crime is the punishment.
What's your favorite Stoic phrase or thought?
I always like it. There's several of them. Like Epictetus once said that somebody stole his lamp, and of course that's an expensive thing in the ancient world. He was very poor. Somebody stole his lamp outside his house, but he said, "I got the better end of the deal because I kept my soul." But the thief stole the lamp and lost his soul, so I got the better end of the deal. And then you have of course, the famous. Let's see if I can scroll through it. The famous quote by Marcus Aurelius. And let me get it right here. Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful, the envious, and unsocial. All these things happen to them because they are ignorant of what is good and evil. But I cannot be injured by any of these. For no one can fix on me what is ugly, nor can I be angry or my kinsmen, nor hate them. So I like that concept. In other
Yeah,
words, and I think really that's why I like the correctives of Stoicism. A lot of Christians believe that somehow you do good things and you're going to be rewarded. And
100%. I agree.
and that's just not what happens. And if God brings suffering into his life, he must not be a just God, because that's the concept of theodicy. The why do bad things happen to good people? Well, bad things are going to happen to all of us. And so rather than asking God to rescue us from our sufferings, we ask God to strengthen us so we can endure our sufferings. And I
That's
think
yeah,
that's lost in a lot of modern in the modern culture. This
yeah.
sense that you just have to survive what life throws at you. And it's like like the Iliad says, to some Zeus gives a basket that's full, and to some he gives baskets that are empty. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah, you got to play
And you
the
know,
cards dealt, don't you? And we should wish, as you said, not for an easy life, but to become better. That's what we should
well,
basically
I
not
think
wish
really,
for, but expect.
I
Um,
think really, I think a better way to put it is that if we have a blessed life, we should let our blessings improve our soul. And if we have a difficult life, we should have our sufferings improve our soul. Whatever happens to us should improve us and not make us worse.
yeah, there's so many Stoic quotes about things like that as well. Like basically, if your life's going bad, you should look at it as a blessing because it gives you a chance to fundamentally become better essentially. There's about 10 different quotes there. Coming back to your quote about the morning thing with Marcus Aurelius, because yeah, he gets up in the morning and says, "Oh, I might meet this kind of person today, this kind of person." But then on the flip side, he's got because I'm writing a book about quotes at the moment, it's something along the lines of waking up in the morning and remembering what a precious privilege it is to be alive. I think is the other one. I think it's Marcus Aurelius anyway. But there's so many quotes, and I actually listen to or read Stoic quotes every day because it sets me up for the day really well. And every time you listen to stuff, like Heraclitus says, about the river, going to river, neither the man nor the river is the same. And it's exactly the same. Every time you read the quote, it hits you a little bit differently, I think, depending on where you are in your own life. So yeah. Is there anything?
Here we go.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
I was going to
Yeah,
say,
like Rufus, like Masonius Rufus, speak of shameful things, and you will lose your reluctance to do them.
yeah, it's like the other one, similar to shame. It's like the shame when you do something like do something bad, basically. The sh- the the fun passes quickly, but the shame endures. But when you do something out of labor, the pain passes quickly, but the elation or something endures, basically. So yeah, there's so many good ones for people to listen to or to read about. Is there anything that from either a Stoic perspective, well, Stoic or philosophic perspective, or from the dementia side that we've maybe not covered that you want to cover?
um, I think basically, of course, the what we're struggling with in our country is the civil rights issues, and the Black Lives Matter and social justice. A lot of Christians really somehow feel that that's this idea that you should pull yourself by your own bootstraps, and this thing that you don't 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 give a man a fish but teach him how to fish. That sort of philosophy can only go so far, and there are just people you just in this life that you just have to help. That's just the way it is, and they're not, and some of them are not going to be grateful. And so I think that uh, really, that is the one thing that's one of my causes is trying to, you know, tell my Christian friends that, hey, you need to be compassionate towards your neighbor. We're losing compassion. I mean, there was like an article in the Atlantic that really summed it up. Summed up and it's really kind of like this one article that's taken hold. The cruelty is the point. So many Christians tend to be cruel rather than compassionate in their dealings with their more disadvantaged neighbor. And so and that is and you see the same sort of traps happening in Catholicism and in the years before World War II, where they really fell towards fascism for many historically complicated reasons.
Yeah, I've
And
got a
so I
great
think,
example as well of that. So from Zen philosophy, like they have these koan stories, and there's one where there's basically the Zen philosopher who's obviously got a school of people who he looks after, and they're all great students apart from this one guy. This one guy started stealing from him, and he stole from him, and everyone knew that he stole from him basically, and he stole again, and everyone kept going to the main teacher, the main guru, saying, "Look, you've got to get rid of this guy, from the school because he's stealing." So what he did is he brought everyone into the room and said, "Look, who thinks that we should get rid of this thief?" And they all said, "Yeah, I think we should get rid of this thief." And he says, You shouldn't be students of mine because actually you don't understand the fact that he needs to be here more than you do." because he doesn't know stealing's bad, but you do. And I think that's a really powerful message. And as you said, you have to help people sometimes, and even if they don't always want to help themselves, from what you said earlier about the virtue, is it down to you to try and instill virtue in someone and take it upon yourself to do something as opposed to leave it for someone else? Because if everyone leaves it to someone else, who's actually going to go ahead and do something?
Yeah, yeah, basically, yes. And so
Where
I
can
think that
so go on.
I like one of the Stoics, the one of the Mandela, Nelson Mandela, has was a also a proponent of Stoicism, and I read his book, Long Road to Freedom, and he when he was in prison, he had lots of time on his hands, and he started reading the Stoic philosophers and really started, you know, adopting many of the Stoic attitudes. And I think it really helped him as he progressed in his political career and got released from prison and whatnot. And so I see that as, as something that is poorly understood in this country anyway.
Absolutely. Is it if people want to reach out to you and regarding the YouTube channel or you personally, how can they go about doing that?
Well, it's www.youtube.com, and now they have the handle. You can do the backslash at reflections mph, reflections plural, mph, like miles per hour, but morality, philosophy, and history. So
Love it, love it. Fantastic.
so well,
So
I thank you for having me on, and we have a lot of other topics we could cover.
yeah,
So
absolutely. I was going to say, I think it would be good to do a part two, because there is a lot of knowledge that you've got, and it would be great to maybe veer off in a slightly different direction or tangent next time. So yeah, I'd be happy to have you back on, Bruce.
okay, that'd be grand. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks again.